Hey guys, right now I'm going to go through the carbs on the XS11. I mentioned earlier in another part of a video, or I don't know which one, that the customer did go through the carbs, did a good job overall in cleaning them and setting them up. But I'm not going to put carbs that I haven't personally inspected back on a fresh top end job, especially when I suspect that the damage in the engine was done from overflowing carbs. So I did find a couple of issues and I'll discuss them in this video. So let's get right to it. I'm going to take a look at the carbs off of the XS11, just kind of give them a quick going over. The reason is, of course, it's not that I don't trust my customer's work. He seemed to have done a really good job on them, but I'm not going to throw these carbs back on a fresh top end without going through them and checking the float levels and just giving them a look-see because, for obvious reasons. As far as the needle position in the slides, we're going to go ahead and leave those. I can't really deal with that until we get it running and do some tuning and things like that. So as far as the slides go, I'm not sure if I want to pull the caps off yet and take a look at them because a lot of times you can tell a lot just by lifting the slides up, and they feel good, they feel even, no binding, so I don't know, we'll think about that. The main thing I'm concerned about is down here, to make sure again that we have good float level and the jets look right. I have the service data on the stock jets. I'm quite confident that these are going to be all stock because the carbs are clearly the stock carbs for this thing. And we'll talk a little bit about the way these are set up and just kind of go through them. All right, we're looking at number 4 from the end here. You can see these old carbs had the wonderful old brass floats, which very rarely ever failed and super easy to test. Just check if they float, like in water or something. I would wager that these do. We can always test them at a later time, but I don't suspect that they are a problem. But it would be good practice to test them. The main thing I wanted to look at here was the float level. Now I looked this up, and this service manual is, and I mentioned this before, these service menus on these old machines are a little sketchy. I even checked the supplement. There isn't any changes to the supplement except a little bit on, they changed something in regards to the identification of the carb in the supplement, and I forgot what else, but it isn't significant. But this is accurate information for our purposes. These, by the way, are the BS34 IIs, I guess. That's the -II or 11. I don't think it's an 11. And so we have a 30.3 millimeter Venturi, and of course they're Mikunis. Now these are a little different Mikunis than what I'm used to seeing, and we'll go over that here in a second. But first thing I want to do is look at the float level. Now I pulled the separate page out for that, and this is one of these situations where the service manual shows it to be tested in a certain way, just like the GPZ750 was, where you actually put the carb 100% upright. So you can see this is the base of the carb, the float sticking up, and then make the measurement, which is roughly 1 inch, so it's 0.972. This is imperial, of course. 0.972 to 1.051. All right, so essentially 1 inch would be good. And I don't know, these, when I see the tangs bent that much, I'm not sure what's going on here, if anything. We'll set the stir at 1/20 to 1 inch, and we'll take a quick look at what it looks like. Definitely within spec. So, he did a good job on these. I'm not saying he didn't. But I just need to verify all this. So, we're going to have to go off the service data. I might do a little perusing on the forums and see if there's any caveats to this. But the other thing I wanted to mention was there's evidence that this rack was, or these carbs rather, were unracked, and you can kind of see that in 2 places. Number 1, you got some kind of butchered up screws here. He may not have done that, I don't know. But number 2 is you got these really nice fuel tees in here, these metal fuel tees, and they feel good. They feel new. A little bit of drag. You can see a little kind of, looks like silicone grease or something around them where they were installed. That would be correct. That's how I would do them. So if he did it, that's great. If anybody else did it, that's fine too. Down here are the vent tees. So you got fuel up here, and the vent tees are down in here. Not vacuum, but vent tees, just to vent the carbs. So these two carbs are connected together, and then these two carbs are connected together. Unlike another type of a inline four where you have a central fuel rail that feeds all four carbs. That's why we have the two fuel cocks and one fuel cock feeding each of the two carbs. So again, these are your vent and then your fuel, and it's the same on both sides. And like I think I just mentioned, these have been replaced with nice metal ones. They look very good quality, so I'm very pleased to see that. Probably some sort of a kit that he or someone obtained. Now the float bolt gaskets, they look all right. This one on number 4 is kind of stuck, and it isn't in all that great shape. In fact, it's looking like it's got a little bit of damage to it right here, like it was pulled off and maybe replaced, and maybe a partial tear. But don't despair, because although these are branded Kawasaki, these are the exact same, how these go, the exact same gaskets. So I have 4 gaskets for it if I need them. I'll use them if I need them. So similar size, most likely the same design float bowl on the Kawasaki one, BS34, BS whatever. Bullshit, but you know, so far this looks good. I'll pull the other 3 off and take a look. The other thing of note, kind of interesting, usually on the ends here, on the end carburetors, you know, this should be a dead end right here for the fuel rail, the fuel system, the fuel connection rather. And this has got a plug here. It's probably decorative, but I don't know for sure, so I'm just going to leave it alone. I seriously doubt the manufacturer would rely on a piece of rubber cap to prevent the fuel from coming out that you know, on the side of the carb in an open channel like that. It'd be kind of like putting a rubber plug on the end of an oil gallery on the engine. I mean, instead of a steel one or an aluminum one or whatever they particularly use. Most likely it's decorative, just to cap that end off. That's not really important to us. Let's take a look at the jets. Well, first of all, what in the God's name is that on the top there? I mean, that's pretty nasty looking right there, that screwdriver slot dealio. Sometimes you have a plug that goes on the top, the jet's down underneath, and then there's like a hole on the side where the fuel goes in to that circuit. I'm trying to figure out how this one works. I honestly don't know. Okay, well, we'll deal with that here in a second. But I wanted to look at what jet sizes are, because it does list that. For example, the main jet is supposed to be a 137.5. 137.5. I can read that, believe it or not. So that's correct. The pilot jet's supposed to be a 42.5. It's got to be down below that. I'm not sure, again, how it gets. Oh, I know how. I know. Yeah. Some of these carburetors, I know exactly what this is. This is definitely a cap off the top here. So the fuel is not allowed to come into your pilot circuit from here. It actually enters through the main. So there's a connection between this main circuit on this standoff to this pilot circuit over here. All we got to do is take this out, and we can take a look at that jet, or maybe get a jet out and look at it. But let's take a look at the condition of it first, and then I'll do the other 3 as well. But yeah, for a minute that threw me off, but then I remembered, that's right, some of these get their slow circuit fuel right off the main circuit. So the main jet pulls up fuel, and it's pulling up fuel all the time essentially for this purpose, because you're getting you're having to feed the slow circuit via a connection between the two. So you know, that's kind of interesting, but some carbs are like that. So you kind of have to pay attention to that when you're working on these carbs, and get your head wrapped around how these things generally work before you tear them apart. Like for example, over here, you have your pickup tube, which you typically see for your enricher circuit, right? And you also have that spot in the float bowl, this hole right there, and then the small little hole that fills up this column of fuel that this dips in to pull fuel up. All right, but generally speaking, you have a connection that goes over to another part of the carb and then snakes around and does different things. This one's just got a tube that comes up, connects over to this circuit. This tube goes up into that circuit for the enrichers. Now, I was reading the service data on this just now, and the service data is pretty interesting. Yamaha spec'd out in these carbs to have what is essentially a two-stage enricher. All right, let's zoom out a little bit and show you what I mean. So this is completely off when they're closed, and when we open up the lever, pull it outwards all the way, we're at full. And then you can back it off to like the middle position, and it's half. And the reason why they did that was they were trying to accommodate the fact that when the engine's cold, it needs to be this rich. But as it warms up, it doesn't need to be that rich. Now you can say to yourself, well, all of them really do that if you back off your choke lever, depending on whether it's on the handlebar or another place. But they don't always necessarily have a detent that latches it in that middle position. So this one's got little balls in here. Balls, yeah. Probably behind there and behind there, because there'll be a detent ball detenting into little grooves on that shaft. You said shaft. And then this is again all the way off. We're not going to mess with that, but it is kind of interesting that when I read that, I went, oh, that makes sense. So let's pull that out. I'm going to get the rest of the float bowls off too, and we need to take a look at that circuit. Off camera, I'm going to do all the, if I need to dabble with a little cleaning, I'll do that off camera. We're just kind of doing an evaluation right now, but I'll blow these circuits out and look at the air jets on the back side of the carb. Okay, so yep, I pulled it off of 4. That's exactly what I was thinking. I don't know what I was thinking. Yeah, once I figured this out. It's early. Give me a break. And so I'll show you what I mean by that. There's a little hole in here. See if I can get you in to see my hole. Oops. Yeah, you see a little hole that connects it over to the main jet? That's where it gets fed from. That's why it's got a cap on it. That's the way the Imagineers decided that they wanted to do it. So that's the way it's done. And like I said, there are quite a few other carb racks out there like this. The only other one I can think of right now that's kind of interesting like this is, interesting I mean by being a pain in the ass, is the older GPZ 550s. They have kind of a machined recess in the top of where normally the fuel would come up through a slow jet circuit. And it's the same thing, it gets fed from your main. But there's a rubber plug that fits in. And there's a feature inside the float bowl that's got like a pronounced area, a little standoff, that when the float bowl is secured, it kind of just bumps up against that and holds it in place. The last time I checked on those were like impossible to get, or nearly impossible to get too. But luckily, you know, Yamaha was thinking when they spec'd these things out to just put a screw with an aluminum crush washer in it. So that's kind of neat. The thing about this is, I'm just going to take a quick look if I can at the slow jets, which aren't very tight. Just want to get an idea what they're obviously new. I'm sure my customer rebuilt these. There it is. Classic Mikuni, it is a bleed type. Yeah, classic Mikuni bleed type slow jet, which is, drum roll please. Oh, I'm going to see out of that. Gee whiz. I should say see through that, not out of that. It is a 45. What I say it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a 42.5. That doesn't really matter at this point, because he may have gotten a kit that has been established by folks that have done more carbs on these than I have to be the proper jetting size for this, including this slow air jet back here. I'm not going to question that at all. I'm just going to verify the integrity of the fuel system in these carbs, or the fuel circuit rather. We'll do again, I'm going to check the rest of the float heights, and I think we're going to do, we're definitely going to do a pressure test on each of these 2 inlets to make sure that these float needles and seats are actually holding, to make sure. Because again, the whole problem with these old carbs is they don't have overflow standoffs in the float balls. So if I can dig up a photo of one, I'll show you, but it'd be typically this is a different drain that you actually see. Usually there's a cast part of this with a machined hole and a screw that goes in with a little taper, and that locks off the drain. But it's also the passage which bypasses that screw for a standoff that goes into the same little drain port on the bottom. And so if the fuel level gets up too high in the float bowl because of a failure here, or a failure up there, which is where the fuel tank is above my head of the fuel cock, it'll bypass out the carb, not overflow into the engine. So, you know, that's a problem, in my opinion, between design. It's really a design problem. You have a vacuum actuated fuel cock, which are crap anyway, and they're prone to failure over the years. And then you don't have any overflow capability to protect the engine and the carbs. So it's just a recipe for a problem to occur in any of these setups like this. So I dislike the setups like this, but you know, it is what it is. We got to work with what we got. All right, so I'm going to check the other float heights off camera and do a couple other things, and we'll come back. Okay, I pulled the float out of number, what is this? Number 3. These float pins are typical to what you see. They got like a nail head on them. They generally only go in one way, and the back end here is a little bit bigger, and that's what holds it in place. So you don't want to tap on these the other way. The best way to get them out is I kind of use a pair of dikes like this, and you get behind the head and you can lever it out against the standoff here, because otherwise you risk breaking one of these off and then you're in a world of hurt. You know, I got to be honest with you, I'm not 100% sure these are the right aftermarket float valves for this, because, you know, these just seem awfully tall. This one, by the way, is off. This one is too, in other words, too low, so the fuel level would be too high in it. All right, another thing that's interesting here is accounting for the difference in the bending. You can kind of figure this out by looking at just the float valves themselves. This float valve in number 3 here, the needle itself, is prouder of the float seat than this one is. And you can look at this needle and it's definitely a little different looking than this one. It's just a little bit. Now, I'm not sure why. I'm not sure if it's at the rubber end or what, but this just doesn't look exactly right. Looks bigger. It's longer. Yeah, I'm not really sure about that. I'm not certain that these are the correct float valve needle side parts for this. I'm not 100% sure. I'm going to go take a look at the parts fiche and make sure that there's not 2 different ones that are, you know, required for 2 carbs. I don't know why they would ever do that, but you never know. Sometimes these manufacturers are weird when it comes to this stuff. Nope, they're all the same. Requires 4 the same. In fact, they're available OEM, brand new, $32 a piece. We're not going to do that. But yeah, I don't know. This is weird. It seems like number 3 here, number 2 are the worst. I don't know. I don't get it, because here's the problem. When you have something that isn't the right height, the float is not going to close properly compared to the other ones. It's like there shouldn't be like no springage at all when the float height is set correctly, as opposed to this one was a lot more. And you can even feel the difference to the springs on the top of the float needles themselves. So I don't know. I'm gonna have to dig into that a little further and see what the deal is with that. Maybe we'll find 4 aftermarkets and put them in just to make sure that we've got 4 of the same, because these definitely, at least these 2, don't look the same. I don't get it. But anyway, we'll figure that part out. So that's going to be something to consider, because I got to take these apart anyway and clean them. There's some dusty stuff up in here, probably from some ethanol fuel that was left over in it, or just fuel in general. And so it just needs to be done. But I do not like the way these floats are sitting with the float tangs on these float needles here. The seats all look the same, but the needles don't. So I got to look into that and see what the deal is on it. Yeah, okay, so on Partzilla, here is the OEM spec one for it. And if you see, the needle is completely different. This is kind of what I would expect on these. All right, especially with the old brass floats. Because another telltale sign on them float needles. Yeah, if you look at these float needles, you can see that there is a little ring around top here. And that's for that little metal clip, wire clip, that holds it to the tang on other types of carbs. And so what happens is when it helps to pull the float open. So when the float drops, this little tang is a positive contact for both closure and opening. Actually, the pin would be, the tip of it would be for closing, but that little wire helps open it up. I don't know why you'd need this type on this carburetor. Generally, it would be like the Kawasaki ones that are just the metal ones like I showed you in that picture. I got a couple of those, and I doubt they're going to fit, but we'll take a look at those as well. I'm not sure if they're the right diameter for that bore. Let's take a look at the stash. Dad's old parts drawer. What's an acronym for that? And under float needles, this is what I'm talking about, Mikuni type needles and Mikuni carbs. All right, so these guys are too tall. They're too proud of the seat. And you have the same situation that you have to really get funky with bending this tang to get them to work. But I do have one, at least. I have 4 others that are used. One other one, which is shorter, that looks like the exact one that you see in that Partzilla thing. These are K&L 18-8956s. I only have one new one, but I do have 4 old ones, but I don't think I'd use those. And we put that one in, and let's get number 4, and then put number 4 in, and we'll take a look at how it seats. All right, now, if we do a check, we're roughly at 1 inches here, we can see that there's some space in here. We can see that there's some space in here where this float valve needs to come up. And that works out good, because you see the tang? The tang is bent up. We need to bend that tang down, which will be roughly flat with the surface of the floats, and I bet you that thing would be dead nuts. Let me try that and we'll check it out. And then I'm going to go over why this is so important. Okay, so I got the tang bent pretty much flat with the body of the float arm, I should say, and whoops, we're really, really close there. So we're definitely within tolerance on this for 1 inch. Actually, could probably go down a skosh more, but it's certainly within tolerance. So you can see, this is the way it really should look. They should not be all distorted and bent up or bent down. In this case, they're all bent up because of the height of these guys. As I indicated before, they're too tall. So, and you can feel you got a nice springage here, okay? The way they would normally operate. Now, when I'm talking about the springage, I want to show you exactly what I mean, why this is really important. We'll take this one out right here, take another float, and I'll give you a tutorial on why this is important. Okay, so here's your float, and here's your tang. And if I can get my camera to focus, I tried this once before, it didn't work so well, but let's try it again. So let's go ahead and exaggerate this a little bit. So if you have a float tang that's at that angle, so if it's coming down at that angle, what's going to happen is, number one, it's going to want to try to cock the float valve over to its side because it's not a direct contact square on it. And that sometimes can help to kind of jam these up because it's not hitting it square like that. The other problem is, and you can kind of see it a little bit there, you see that top edge of that, where that clip I mentioned before is supposed to go? If it's at this kind of angle, this thing can only go down a tiny bit because it's designed to go down like this. You see? So you really don't want these things to a point where you have you're not square, because again it will force that needle over to the side, this float valve rather, over to the side a little bit, but more importantly it absolutely limits the amount of travel you have because it's not square with the tip. I mean, there's only a certain amount of distance here that this thing can travel down. And if you consume some of that distance by a float tang that's at the incorrect angle to it like this, then it's not going to work right. And trust me, even if it's closing it off, it's not going to work right. So right now this is really close to 1 inch where it's supposed to be. The carburetors are in the position the service manual says to test them in, and we've got good feel like springage here, okay? So these are the right float valves to put in this thing. And the seats are really nice condition because they're new. So I would say that I need to order another set of these guys. Whoops, well, it's the same thing. But I need to order another packet of these guys. These are the old ones. I don't think I trust them because they do have a little ridge on them. And these 8956s, if I get a set of 4 coming in, which won't take that long, we'll just have to eat shipping on it. This is really the proper way to set these up. So I'm not going to be able to really do any testing until I correct that. But I hope you understand what I'm talking about when it comes to this. You definitely want these things as close to perpendicular to the float valve, the float needle, as possible. So they're compressing that down the way it's designed to compress them down. Another way to kind of illustrate what I'm saying here, because I'm trying to be as clear as possible and not botch the description and explanation here. But so what I've done is, you saw before I had number 4 in with the correct needle. So I went ahead and I put number 3 in with the old needle that the customer had in there, less the little piece of hair there. And the floats are both set at basically the correct float level. But you notice the tang here versus the tang over here, okay? And you can see the difference in the bend. So there's the number 4, and this is how all of them will look once we get the correct needles in. And then you see number 3 over here and how it's stuck up. You're stuck up. You know, it's all stuck up. So I hate it when it's stuck up. So anyway, what I'm saying here is when you push down on here and you get that spring tension, you see how much distance we have or movement it has to keep preload on that float valve. And over here, we got barely at all. And again, that's because this thing is at the wrong angle. So it's not hitting that tip of that, I guess you want to call it, for lack of a better term, a little spring, you know, tit on the end of the float valve. And now granted, different valves have different travel on that little feature, but for illustration purposes, you can see with those old float needles, you have very little movement here. And this preload is very, very important on keeping these things even. Because remember, fuel, moving, vehicle like this, like a motorcycle, it's sloshing around these float bowls, and so it's rather dynamic. And so if you have this little amount of pressure on that float valve, it'd be very easy for the float level to get skewed because it's not controlling it as fluidly, for lack of a better term, as it should be when you're in this kind of situation here. So I guess the best way to describe it would be is kind of like a dampening or a control, a smoothing of the fuel level in each carb when these have the proper float needles in them, and you have this kind of ability for it to manage that through this spring tension, again, the preload against the float valve. All right, so I hope I explained that a little bit better so you kind of understand where I'm going with this. And I mean, this will work, but it won't work great. And you got to remember, carburetors, and I've said this before, carburetors are precision fuel metering instruments. That's really what they are. You gotta, when you work on carbs like this, you have to really embrace that mindset. That carburetors are a precision fuel metering or delivery system for an engine, especially when you got 4 of them. So anyway, I hope I explained that a little bit better. But you know what we could do? You can go ahead and pressure test this one by just blocking this one off with my finger. Harder to do when you got 3 others to block off like that. You need web hands for it. So, since I don't have that, we're only going to do this one because the other 2 are out of the loop right now. Let's go ahead and test this to make sure that it's going to work. Because again, that's a new float valve. The seats look good, assuming there's no dust in there, and we can kind of blow it out once we pressurize it if we need to. And we'll see if it holds a pressure test. Now, these metal ones typically do have a little bit of leak down on them, just a little bit, until it gets down to maybe, 2 psi or so. But we'll see what we got here. See if I can get that in the shot as well, so you can see both. And geez, I tell you what, we're having trouble with focus today. Focus! All right, now we'll hold this one off. We'll pump up the manufacturer approved testing apparatus. What's an acronym for that? Assuming it doesn't have any pinholes in it like it did before. Blow it out. Make sure there's no dust in there. And there's usually a little droppage as the thing kind of settles in. Droppage? Not a word, but I've done enough of these where I kind of know the difference between the rubber tipped ones and the metal ones, how they react. You can see right now this thing is decaying slightly, but it's really getting down to a point where I think it's just going to settle out. There's not a tremendous amount of pressure on these as opposed to a fuel pump bike. So you can see she's kind of flattening out around 2, and we don't have a significant amount of decay anymore. So I'd call this one good. I would definitely trust this one. Again, putting air to these metal-to-metal ones is not always 100% because they're not designed for air. They're designed to restrain fuel. But you get the idea. So I would say that this would work fine. And so we need to get another set of 4 and then put the metal ones in there, and then the other float valves, and then test both sides independently. So 2 and 2, and then I think this is going to be in a heck of a lot better shape than what it was before, because it is just not good to have those float tangs rather bent around so much for what I explained before. It's just not good. I'll show you 2 more things on its side here, so we don't have to flip it over and potentially damage something here. Here's your slow screw adjusters, and these have to be aftermarket, I'm assuming, because number 1, they look new, and number 2, they have little, like a knurl type thing where you can grab them, do a classic reach around in there, and adjust these by hand if you can so fit your fat hands in there like mine, or you can use the Motion Pro 90-degree tool and go in there and adjust these once it's running. I'm not sure what they're set at now, but I'll bring them out to whatever the factory setting is and double check that at a different time. These are your synchronization adjuster screws. You notice there's only 3 for 4 carburetors because 1 is a fixed carb. It's generally number 3, which will be the carb you adjust each of the other 3 to. So you want this one to be your base. And when you're doing synchronization, you have to turn these screws generally counterclockwise, which will actually close the butterfly a little bit, because that increases the vacuum. When the butterfly is closing and the space is less, the vacuum increases because an intake charge has a smaller area to pull air through, so thus the vacuum goes up thusly. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but generally you turn these counterclockwise, it closes it down to raise, and you want to lower the vacuum in a particular one, you just go the other way, and it opens it up slightly. The vacuum pulse will drop slightly, and then you can do it from there. The other interesting thing I noticed about these carbs is because it's got a vacuum advance, this is kind of cool. Number 2, this port here from number 2 is what goes to the vacuum advance. And it's got an interesting little cutaway almost. It's kind of hard to see. If I can get a light in there, which I probably can't, I'd show you it. Let me try this one. Yeah, you can see it now. You see a little cutaway on the butterfly? It's lined up with the port for that. And that's pretty interesting how they do that. So I'm not really sure the vacuum dynamics or the engineering behind it, but it stands to reason that when you have an air impulse going through that spot, even when you start to open the throttles up like this, okay? you have an air impulse going through this spot. That little groove is going to channel that air more directly through that, or right by that spot. And therefore, because typically when you open the throttle up, your vacuum is going to get lower. But what this is doing is pulling a vacuum on that diaphragm as you crack this open, and there's a certain amount of vacuum on it to start with. But as soon as you crack this open and that air is kind of passing at a higher velocity, I'm assuming through that little slot right there, or by that slot, that's what's providing your increased vacuum for that. And of course, you know, it's not like it bounces back and forth. The vacuum is pulled on the diaphragm and it kind of hangs there. It'll decay off of there a little slower than you might think. So therefore your vacuum advance kind of stays where you want it, depending on what your throttle position is. That's what I'm guessing, at least, because I can't see any other reason for them to do that as far as that kind of feature in a butterfly. But kind of cool. Never seen that before either. So yeah, we'll get the rest of these out of here because we're not going to need them. I don't want to lose them. Show them to the customer. All right, so that's going to be the plan. Okay, so we're done fussing with some carbs. I'm glad I did. Found a couple issues. You know how a perfectionist I am, especially with carbs. They got to be exactly right. Otherwise, no bueno. They don't go back on. Because I don't like problems. And if I know that those are right, that's less of a potential source for what I don't like. So if you like this, don't hesitate to subscribe, give me a thumbs up, share the video, like the video, and ring the notification bell. You guys know what to do. You're smart. You watch YouTube. Right. So until next time, don't just repair, restore, like I'm doing right here. And thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.